Hi guys, and welcome to Mastering V-Ray Lesson 8 Part 2. You'll notice I recently skipped ahead to creating Lesson 9 instead of creating this lesson, and that was simply because I wasn't happy with the results I was achieving out of V-Ray when trying to make snow. After spending quite a bit of time using various methods to reproduce it, I kind of eventually hit a dead end and had to look outside the box for answers on how to create more detailed and photorealistic snow, and I ended up resorting to using Octane to create the effect and learn more about how snow works because I had that real-time feedback. The problem is that by the time I'd gotten those results out of Octane, Lesson 9 was overdue, so I skipped ahead to buy myself a bit more time with this lesson, and I'm happy to say I'm pretty pleased with the results. But unfortunately, I couldn't achieve the same kind of realism that I was getting out of Octane. So because of that, I'll also include a basic rundown of how I achieved it there also. And hopefully in the future, I'll be able to devote a full course to Octane because it is a really cool render engine. It is, like, I can't say it enough. It is such a fun render engine to use when you've got I've obviously got those two titans working with it. And having that real-time feedback, it's just insane. You can just layer up as many shaders as you want, all in real time. There's real-time displacement, real-time subsurface. It just made things so much easier. And then when I jumped back in V-Ray, it kind of felt like I was, kind of 10 years in the past. Now, even though I think it's really awesome, it isn't fully production ready yet. There's some limitations that I'm not, that happy with at the moment that I feel like should be in the render engine by now. But until those are there, I won't be creating that course. But hopefully you guys get a little bit excited for that once you kind of see what's possible in the engine when you do have a couple of really fast cards working on it. So to get started, the first thing I'm going to do is set up a quick scene that includes a basic ocean and iceberg object. The modeling and detail isn't at a production level, but it should help to demonstrate the different effects that can be achieved with the V-Ray SSS2 shader that we're going to be predominantly using in this lesson. I also got asked a few times how to set up Ocean, and although I'll save a detailed breakdown of that for my lighting course, what I'm about to show you is pretty standard these days and will get the job done and looks pretty good. I'm sure you all know about Phoenix FD, but one cool feature the demo has is that available for free is a great displacement map that uses the Tessendorf algorithm to produce waves using displacement. I've recently seen guys like Peter Guthrie and Bertrand Benoit using it a lot, and in all the years I've been trying to create oceans, this is the quickest and easiest solution so far. So let me just quickly run through the scene for you and show you what I've got set up, and then we'll just work through some of the points I want to get across to you when you are working with this fast SSS2 shader. So you can see from the latest render I've got up here that the end result looks pretty good, but the thing that's letting it down the most is the lack of detail in the model. So if you put the effort into creating that nice detailed geometry, the shader will do the work for you. I've just set it up to a point where it looks realistic enough where you can see all the effects happening, but without having to go in and spend days sculpting a really detailed surface. So like I was saying earlier, we've just got a very simple scene. It's as usual, it's just got one dome light lighting the scene. We've got the iceberg here, which has just kind of been slapped together. I've got underneath the ocean surface, the iceberg gets bigger, and that's so we can see the underwater effect happening and how the water itself has that blue fog color applied. At the base I have a V-Ray plane just to block the HDR from coming through at the base. And then on the top I've just got a simple plane with a square number of subdivisions and a V-Ray displacement over the top with a Phoenix FD texture. So because I've installed the Phoenix FD demo, you'll see here that you get a couple of different textures available, and one of those is the Phoenix FD Ocean texture. So if you just use that, if you haven't set it up before, when you do apply that texture to the surface in the displacement mod, V-Ray will ask you if you want to change some settings, because it's quite a unique map in that it's a vector displacement. So when you are using it, down the bottom here, you will need to set up a couple of settings if it hasn't already done it for you in order for that displacement to come through. So in displacement, you'll need to set it to tangent. You can change the edge length of your pixels to determine how detailed you want that to come through. And I usually use a pretty low amount on the ocean. If you go any higher, the ocean starts to look really rough. And when you do create a really rough ocean, you have to start adding in extra features like height-based coloring and crests on the wave, and it makes things a little bit more complicated to set up when you do have a more rough ocean. So for this scene, I've just kept things simple. You can see in our reference, most of the time where there is icebergs, the water is quite calm without much detail. But when you do go to a bigger scale, obviously then you'll have to start increasing that displacement amount to get an effect like this. I should also note that the bigger the iceberg becomes, the more diffuse it appears on the surface, and you're losing that SSS effect. You can see down the bottom that we still have that green color tint coming through, but it's nowhere near as prevalent as, say, a small scene like this, where you can literally see that blue glow coming through. So this particular scene, we've got an iceberg that's a similar size to this, probably about 10 to 15 meters across max, and going underwater about 20 meters or so. So in the ocean, in the Phoenix FD ocean texture, there's a couple of settings I've got here to create this effect. And you can see it's all real time when you change this, so it's quite easy to use. Feel free to just experiment. The first thing I want to point out is the level of detail. And if I just go down here, let me just bring it all the way down. You can start to see, similar to when we're working with Burcon and we increase the levels, where we're adding an extra level, it's kind of just adding another layer of detail at half the size and half the intensity. With Ocean, you can see if you go up, after a while, it starts to become a little bit less noticeable. So even though we're only at 6 levels of detail here, we're seeing a pretty large area being displaced. So if we zoomed in on one point here, we'd notice that even though we can't see it now, more detail is actually coming through. For this particular scene, I've set the level of detail to 12, because that's when I stop noticing that extra little bit. I've kept the wave height at 1, and I've made it quite sharp. You can see if I go down on the sharpness here also, it's just going to create a softer ocean surface and a calmer ocean surface. And usually this will work more for something like lakes, where you're not getting a strong wind direction coming through, creating those peaks on the waves. It's more just the rippling effect of the water itself. So like I was saying, I've got the sharpness set up quite high. And I'll just do a quick render through with some different settings in a second, but I'm just running you through. The velocity coherence will affect the straightness of the waves and how strong that wind is pushing in one direction. So the lower we go here, you can see the waves start to ripple and kind of wobble in a more even way. So there's not one little bit of wind pushing the whole surface through. If you were to create a larger ocean scene, you probably would want to go higher on that, because I'm not sure exactly how the physics behind it work, but once you get a bit of gust of wind pushing the wave, it's blocking the next wave from that wind, and you end up with just a very strong directional effect happening. But because we're in a calm area in this particular scene, like I was saying, I've just got it down so you can see the effect is a little bit more random and chaotic. The last thing is the wave crest. And as you go down, once again, you're producing a similar effect to just standard water not on a large scale where you are just getting those even ripples and distribution. So for this scene, to create a more ocean-like appearance, I've just gone a bit higher. So let me just duplicate this displacement map and I'll show you the difference that can make. Because I do have a plane set up here that's not extremely massive, so the displacement's running really slow. When I do change the camera angle, I've just moved the plane so that we're seeing a little bit more into the distance. In terms of the render settings in the scene, once again, I do have divide shading subdivs turned off, so you'll see that there's quite low subdivs on everything once we get to that. But it's a similar render setup to the previous lesson you were seeing in the environment fog. So let me just render this, I'll pause the recording and start it up when it's done. As you can see, the water looks pretty good, it just looks a little bit more choppy now. So I'll save this render and then we can compare the two just to show you the difference. As you can see, the original waves I set up look a little bit more realistic, a little bit less choppy, because when you do go out to the ocean, you're not going to see such small ripples like this. And even though it's subtle, things like that do have a pretty large impact on the realism and perception of scale in your scenes. So just feel free to play around with this ocean displacement. It's kind of self-explanatory because you can see the effect of what you're changing in real time. So it's not one of those things where I need to run through and render off 10 different types of settings. One last thing, you'll see the waves are pretty small scale. They're not that high compared to the iceberg itself. If you want to go higher and you want your waves to be stronger, just increase the amount. I'd say for a rough deep sea ocean displacement, you'd go 1 meter on the waves. But it's totally up to you guys. It's totally up to you. Alright, so moving on, let me just close that render. I just want to explain to you how I set up water materials. Now it's pretty interesting because I've been asked quite a lot how to set up ocean and water shaders, and at the end of the day it's always been quite simple. There's not a lot of stuff you need to set up to create an actual realistic water material in V-Ray. So I've just got a default material here. Let me just reload that. When you want to create water, one thing that's useful, and I think I remember seeing Vlado even post about this when people were asking him, is just to keep a little bit of diffuse value in the water, that you just to tint the water a tiny little bit so that it does pick up a little bit of diffuse. So when you set your watercolor, just go off your reference, basically set it to the correct kind of subsurfacey type color. Then in the refraction, instead of going all the way to 255, feel free to drop that depending on how many impurities you'd think would be in the water. So a great example there is if you were looking at like an Amazon river where inside the water itself you've got lots of mud and other particles that aren't refractive that give the water a more solid appearance. So that's where you would go down on the refractive amount, and if I just bring up the background here in the shader, you can see now that there actually is a little bit of that diffuse value coming through. So for underwater, like I was saying, that mud effect, now that that's there, let me just quickly set this up and I'll show you how it looks in our scene. In the fog color, I'm just going to go a little bit bright. In the fog multiplier, I'm going to have to go down quite far. Can just start out with 0.01. In the refraction, I'm going to go to a little bit higher and just play with this until I've kind of got something I like. In the reflection, we're going to go full 255. Because water is such a standard material, we don't need to use a custom BRDF and a custom reflectance curve. So I'm just going to untick this button and then swap it to 1.33, which is the IOR of water. If you want, you can change the refractive glossiness, and because I do have divide shading subdivs turned off, I'm just going to lower the subdivs amount. And I'm going to bring down this glossiness to 0.5 just to blur that just a little bit. So if I apply this to the ocean now and do another render, we'll see what happens. So as you can see, not the best result. You do need to make a couple of modifications. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into the diffuse and just ease up on the saturation a little bit. And I'm going to go a little bit brighter on the fog color and just re-render. And then I'll show you how to do it with V-Ray's Fast SSS 2 shader, which in my opinion produces a better result. So I'm not even going to let this finish because it just doesn't look good enough. So I'm just going to cancel this render and then show you how to do the same thing with the Fast SS2 shader. So inside the shader, what you can do is you can set the preset to water, then go down into the single scatter options and set it to ray traced and refractive. And if I put the background in here, I just need to increase the scatter radius, and you can see we have a refractive material now that also has all the subsurface features as well. So in my opinion, when you're doing things like dirty water and muddy water, this is a much better option to go through. And I'm pretty sure lesson 11 is going to be about foliage. So in that lesson, I'll make sure to include a little feature on getting water, because I have gotten some really photorealistic results using this method. So once again, in the scatter color, I'm just going to tint it a little bit and assign that to the ocean surface. Just increase the diffuse amount just a little bit. I'm going to back that off in a second. And render again. And you'll notice the SSS2 shader is slower to render than your typical V-Ray material. So once again, not the best example to be rendering muddy like water out in the middle of the ocean. But I will show you that in lesson 11. So let me just cancel this and set this up with a little bit more realistic settings. So I'm going to take out the diffuse component of the SSS2 shader and just introduce a little bit of blue. I'm going to tick trace reflections and make the IOR 1.33. Actually, I will just put in a little bit of a diffuse value here. I'm just going to tint it a little bit blue. And we'll see how this looks. Now, as this is rendering, you can see it looks a lot more realistic now, but I should point out that one other thing that will affect the overall appearance of your water is the ground plane that you have underneath. And depending on how bright that is, it's kind of like a fake, because you have to realize that at this level in the ocean, you're not going to see the floor. There's not going to be any light reaching it. And if there is, it's going to be so dark that it's not going to have that much of an effect on the overall appearance of the water. But when this finishes, I'll just show you what raising the color and intensity of that ground plane can actually do for your scene. And the other great thing is that unlike the last couple of lessons, the render times aren't so bad anymore. So it is not so painful to test this stuff out if you don't have a render farm. I'm just going to sample the material on the ground plane. And you can see it's quite dark. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to raise the intensity of that and give it a bit of color. And I'm going to re-render the scene. Just going to cancel that and just make it a little bit brighter. I'm just going to bring it to the surface a bit more. And we should see a little bit more of a lighter blue appearance in the water. So you can get a feel now for, just by changing that floor plane, we've added a little bit more life into the water. It doesn't look so dark and dull. So let me just cancel this. I'll duplicate it again. And I'll just make it green this time. And if I bring up Photoshop, what you can use this for is say if you wanted to create this effect of a little bit more illumination in the water, as opposed to, you can see it's quite dark here, is just playing around with those colors. And it's what I've used on production jobs also to get that effect. On top of obviously having the fog color and the SSS applied correctly. So you can see now if I zoom right inside these pixels, even though it's a bit noisy, you can see a bit of that color coming through now. So after this render's finished, then I'll move on to showing you how I created this iceberg material itself. Then after that, we'll load up the snow scene that I was working on that I wasn't completely happy with, but I'll run you through that one also. And then lastly, I'll jump into Octane and show you there also. So there you go. But I've just decided, now that I've seen this final render, that there's kind of one thing missing that I want to point out when you're working with the ocean, and that's when the sun is directly reflecting into the ocean itself. And now, because the sun is such a hard reflection in the water, you need to soften it off a little bit. So just before we move on, let me just grab this V-Ray material shader here and apply that to the scene. And you'll notice in the reflection glossiness, I've just dropped that down to 0.98. Now, even though that's not physically correct and water will be 100% mirror-like in its reflection, depending on if there's no noise I'm talking about, when it comes to rendering in 3D, you need to alter that just a little bit, just so that you're not getting such harsh reflections in here. And if I zoom into a render eye, which is in the same exact scene that I set off last night, you can see the default. Sorry, I might just need to load that up again. Sorry, I've just loaded that up again. You can see in the raw render that the reflections of the sun are extremely harsh. So to get around that, what you can do is it's just a little trick. I'm going to duplicate that and blur the water. And then I'm just going to mask paint that in exactly where I want it. Obviously a retouch will go in and do this a little bit more precisely, but the difference is quite massive. Because in reality you are going to be seeing flares and pings and bloom coming off those highlights. You can do it in V-Ray yourself, but if you do notice it, just drop the reflection a little bit, add a little bit more blur in Photoshop, and then also turn on bloom and glare in the render itself and adjust settings to what you're after. But I don't think that this bloom effect works perfectly in these situations. I prefer to do it in Photoshop. So moving on to the iceberg shader itself, once again it consists of 3 layers, and I'll just render off what each of these layers is doing and then break down why I've set it up this way for you. So let me just apply the simple diffuse material that has no subsurface or refraction. You can see if I go in here, it's non-refractive. But the reason I use a V-Ray material is because I want to have reflection that's a lot more blurry than what I'd be able to get out of the SS shader itself. So you can see if I go into the SSS2 shader, you do have the option to turn on diffuse, and I do have it available there, but I want to independently change the glossiness. So you can see on the top layer of the fast SSS2, I've got a different specular glossiness value, and I should probably have it on here too. I think that was set up just a little bit incorrectly. But let me just render off what the diffuse itself looks like. So just that material by itself, obviously the render is going a lot faster now, but just having a simple V-Ray material and a correctly set up HDR produces a pretty decent snow shader in itself. But we're lacking those features that are visible here in the subsurface itself. So that is why I go in and add an extra layer to it. So I'm just going to render off the first SSS layer now. As you can see, the SSS feature is visible, but it's just much smaller. And the reason I've done that is because I only want it to show up in the small crevices and things like that, like cracks. Now lastly, if we go in and look at our reference again, sorry, let me just bring it up in Photoshop. Lastly, you can see there's large scale scattering, and that's visible throughout the whole thing. So this current layer is giving us the feature on the corners, up here and along here. Now we need the overall SSS shader, and this is why this base layer is the most visible layer in the shader. Now one thing that's happening here is when we do render off this entire layer by itself, this is where my point comes across trying to use multiple layers in the shader. When we do have a larger scatter radius in the material itself, we lose a lot of the small scale details because it's simply blurring them. But at the same time, we can't get that large scale effect any other way. At least that I know how. So now let me just cancel this, and I'll make another V-Ray blend material, and I'll just blend the two subsurface shaders together. And render this through again. As you can see, blending the two together now, we still have the large scale detail, but now we're starting to see some ridges and small scale bump and things like that that weren't there just with a single shader. So that's why I use both. But as you can see, there's one thing missing, and if I go to some reference here, it still just doesn't feel solid enough. And that's why I blend in a third V-Ray material, just to give it that last little bit of a solidity and remove this effect that is pretty obviously a V-Ray SS2 shader, if you know what I mean. Like you can kind of see when someone's overused SSS. Whereas when I was working with Octane, I felt like it was producing a much more photorealistic result. And you'll see that it's pretty exciting once I get into that in the lesson. So let me just cancel this. Now we need to take a deeper look into the actual settings I've used in this SSS shader itself. So I'm just going to go into this layer here. Actually, what I'll do is I'll just start from scratch and rebuild the material for you, just so that I'm not rehashing what I've already done. So I'm just going to make a fast SSS2 shader. I'm not going to change the preset. I am going to make the IOR 1.33. And I'm just going to add a small amount of diffuse to it. I'm going to turn on the background here just so we can see it. Now, in the subsurface color, it's probably a good idea to start out just with something that's a grayscale value. You don't want to complicate things too much, trying to blend the scatter color and the subsurface color together. Now the scatter color is what's going to be shown in here. The scatter color is going to be this color coming through. So I'm just going to set that up just to roughly what I think is going to work. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go down into the multiple scattering. You can see it's set to ray traced. I'm going to leave that as is. In the single scatter, I'm going to set it to ray traced and solid. You can use simple if you're far away or there's not much detail, but to get a more physical result, I set it to ray traced and solid. Now it's also important to note that once again, in the render settings, I do have divide shading subdivs turned off, so I can drop the scatter subdivs. And I'm just going to leave the refraction depth to 5. Even though for something as simple as this object, I could probably go lower to 3. I'm going to tick scatter GI. In the specular glossiness, I can change that to whatever I really want. But as you can see here, you don't see very strong, sharp reflections coming through. If you give me a second, I'll just find a bit of reference where you can actually see a really glossy iceberg. So you can see here that because this iceberg's melting so much, the uniformity of the molecules making up the iceberg has become a lot more even, and therefore when that happens, we lose that rough surface appearance and it starts to become a lot more glossy. So what I found is that the more melted and more hot you want your iceberg to appear, the higher you go on the glossiness. So I'm going to set it to 0.5. I'm also going to turn on trace reflections, and once again drop those down to 0.4, and we'll just render this off where it's at just to see how this is looking. I haven't changed the scatter radius yet though, but I'll leave that there. So it's not a bad start, but like you can see, there's not enough of the subsurface appearance coming through. So in order to do that, you can do two things. You can change the scale, or you can change the scatter radius. It's the same thing. I'm going to leave the scale at 1, even though in these shaders, oh well, it's actually at 1 here. I originally had it at 100 because my scene scale wasn't set up correctly. So I'm going to leave the scale at 1, and I'm going to change the scatter radius to be about 20 centimeters, and just do a region render here. And as you can see, it starts to appear a little bit more soft. Now, the phase function is going to determine whether the material is forwards or backwards scattering. The interesting thing is I couldn't find any scientific data to determine whether or not like ice like this behaves more like marble or more like skin. And I ended up speaking to a couple of old workmates. One of them recommended using quite heavy forward scattering with a scatter radius of about 10 to 20 centimeters. So I'll show you what both look like just to let that sink in. So this is with a value of 0.8 on forwards. I'll just do a little region render here and go minus 0.8. So the end result is that when you use backwards scattering in the phase function, the material becomes a little bit darker and the subsurface effect comes through stronger. And when you use forward scattering, less of the subsurface appearance is coming through and you get more of a diffuse value, sorry. Now, like I said, I couldn't find scientific data to back that up. So you're basically going to have to judge it by eye. But for now, I'll leave it at, say, 0.6. Now, there's one more thing to adjust, and that's the subsurface color itself. You can see I've left it grayscale at the moment, but what I did to add a little bit more realism was introduce a little bit of a tinted color so that I got the appearance like there was impurities in the ice itself. Now, not every single iceberg is going to have those impurities in it. You can see this particular iceberg is almost completely white, but when you do have material that's a little bit more rough and closer to the shore, you are going to be picking up some of those impurities that are in the water. And you can see here that when I zoom in, I'm talking about these areas here where there's just a little bit of color visible. So I'm just going to over exaggerate that color and do a region render. And you'll see what that does. Now the material itself looks quite a lot more dirty. And we're getting an over exaggerated feel of this here. So I'm just going to drop that off. It is subtle. I'm not saying go overboard with this. But I personally found it just added a little bit more to the realism of the image. It's probably still just too much there. It needs to be quite subtle. So that about wraps up kind of what I was going for when making the iceberg material. Now, depending on how large you want your iceberg to feel, just adjust these two settings here if you're going to use my specific shader. So if you have a much larger iceberg, I'd crank up this a little bit higher and drop this down. And I'll show you what that looks like. So using those settings, now the iceberg looks a lot bigger. And it looks a lot more like this as opposed to the small scale stuff. So you're getting more of this effect coming through. Now there's one last little thing that you might be wondering how to produce, and it's sometimes difficult to get it right away. And one little quick trick I do to get the effect I'm talking about down here in the water, this glowing effect, you can see it underneath. It's almost becoming brighter than above the water. You'll notice now my render doesn't actually have that. So what I was playing with to get that effect is just putting a light under the water. Just move this render out of the way. And when I was using the light, I was putting in a strong color just so that I wasn't giving the appearance of kind of a faked effect. I was trying to integrate that glowing look without over brightening the ice or anything like that. So let me just drop this in and I'll do a render to show you what that looks like. Let me just duplicate this. The difference is quite massive, and you can see very easily you can reproduce that effect that you're seeing here. It's not physically correct, and it will take just a little bit of a trial and error positioning where you want that. You don't have to use just one light either. Feel free to use it wherever you want. Let me just cancel this, and I can just move it under here to show you kind of how that can affect things differently. And I'll add another light over here and just re-render that, but it adds a lot more life to your image. So placing the lights in that position doesn't look as good, and it just goes to show that, like I was saying, it's not physically correct, but if you just do a little bit of experimentation, you should be able to get a pretty nice result out of that. So that wraps up what I was trying to show you with this iceberg material. Now I just want to load up the snow scene, which uses pretty much the same way, just with modified settings, and I'll run you through that. So when I was originally looking for reference images to use and try and reproduce shaders for, I came across this really cool snow image that showcases how, under the right lighting conditions, snow can be extremely reflective and glossy while at the same time appearing very diffuse and matte. So depending on where the light's hitting it changes the way the snow appears. So in order to recreate this material, once again it's based on 3 individual layers, except this material has a little bit more into it in terms of detail. So if I go into the base material here, and I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of this because I've already explained the settings utilized on the iceberg shader, and these are just modifications of those, but I'll just run you through the extra detail I've added into the scene. So in the dirt material, in the unoccluded color, rather than using white, I've just used a slightly off yellow color. In the reflection glossiness, I've used a splat map, which is a really nice procedural map for creating kind of flaky like highlights, and I've just had to modify those colors so that they're not fully black and white because it was appearing too matte. The whiter you go on these colors, the more reflective and glossy the material is going to appear. I've also got a bump map, which is just a composite of the splat map that we used in the reflection glossiness and 2 variable Bircon noise maps. And that was just to give a little bit more flaky detail that you can see here. Because one of the hardest things to reproduce when you're creating snow is that small scale speckling. In the first fast SSS2 layer, you can see I've gone for a very strong scatter color with a scatter radius of 30. And the top layer is a slightly darker color with a much smaller radius. So if I swap to the SSS2 layer of this shader, you can see the effect this is having on the scene, and it looks quite cool. near the peaks and the highlights, you can see that there's that really nice color bending coming through the image. If I swap to the specular pass, you can see that it's quite noisy, but that's not because of anti-aliasing issues, that's because of all the bump mapping and things like that in the scene. And this was the biggest issue I had with V-Ray, trying to create those small scale bumps. I was much more successful in Octane. If I just bring up the image again, you can see in the shadows there is that subtle color coming through that I've tried to match as closely as possible. And the biggest thing preventing this from being photoreal is just a lack of detail in the model. If this was a production job, I would have gone in and created some displacement maps and bump maps and just manually gone in and added that detail in ZBrush. Instead, I've just tried to show you how I've created this specific shader. We'll just do one more render from another angle. So as you can see, from a completely different view, you're not getting any of those specular highlights. Yet when you look at the reflection, it's extremely reflective. So just be careful when you're setting up your snow scene not to make your material too diffuse, because it often comes down to the way in which light is hitting your scene. If I swap to the SSS pass, you can also see now when the light is behind us, there's a lot less coming through. Okay, there's one more thing I wanted to cover in this lesson, and that was the Octane stuff. So I'm just going to load that up now and run you through how I set that up and how it's an extremely useful way to work. So the images you can see up on the screen here are all raw renders straight from Octane, and the reason they look so good is because Octane has recently added in displacement as a feature, and it handles displacement extremely well. So when you are zooming in here, this is all little granules of snow that very accurately represent kind of how real snow behaves, in that it's not just a flat surface with bump mapping, it's a very complex structure. And this is what I was struggling to reproduce in V-Ray, because whenever you use a subsurface shader with a surface that requires this much displacement, V-Ray ends up hanging, and it just takes hours and hours to get anywhere, let alone see something that you can work with. So some of these renders are quite large. This one, for example, was rendered off overnight. And if I just go full screen, every single one of these little flakes is a bit of geometry. And all the little highlights here are part of the shader itself. So the little pings are just an extra layer added that reflects. So let me just go into Octane now, and I'll show you kind of how it works. And you can see here in real time I'm just rotating around, and this is just one layer of the shader, and I construct it. If I just bring this shader network onto my main screen here, I'm constructing it in a way very similar to V-Ray. I've got a subsurface shader which is producing the snow, the blue tint through the snow, and then there's a diffuse material which also has some scattering, but that's producing the more solid appearance. And then I blend those two together into a single material here. And then lastly, over the top of that, I'm blending in a flake material, and that is blended in using a grayscale image of just some powder. So all I made is I made a black and white grayscale image. Let me just load that up for you. So as you can see, this map I made is used to blend over the flakes. I'll provide all these maps in the scene files for you guys, because I do think they are useful. So there was actually quite a lot of assets I created for this that I'll package up for you guys. You can see here, if I zoom in, it's actually quite a complex map. I made this by using Forest Pack to scatter some flakes, and that's why there's height for it. That's why there's height as well. The displacement map I'm using, I'll also load that up. So if I zoom in here, it's a similar map to the flake map I used, but this time a lot more dense. So this is what's actually displacing the flakes, and it is tileable. So I'll also provide that for you guys. Now, what I did do is, after using Octane to set everything up, I did go back into V-Ray and try and use the exact same workflow to reproduce the effect, but it was just too slow. I couldn't physically get V-Ray to render snow out using such high-res displacement. So let me just apply the overall shader to the scene here. And you can see if I zoom in extremely far into the mesh, and just let that render quickly, you can see all the little flakes making up the snow, which I thought was quite crazy. If I go into the materials displacement property, I'll just have to pause this, sometimes it gets a little bit slow. I'm just going to drop the power down and reload. Actually, from memory, this power option wasn't working with displacement specifically. So in order to reduce the displacement effect, I had to go into the actual map itself and adjust that. But I mean, as you can see, the level of detail that Octane can produce, even just zooming in still even further, let me just fix up the autofocus here. It's quite crazy, and because it's real time, you're able to adjust all this stuff and get everything perfect. And the end result was exactly what I wanted to get, that nice powdery snow. So I will provide all these scene files for you. There's a couple of scenes I was prepping for within V-Ray also that I'll include that weren't featured in this lesson specifically. But I hope you get a lot out of these scenes. And I know that the overall soft snow feeling, I didn't get it in this lesson, but if I ever do, I'll just include that in the scene files, because V-Ray may be updated in the future and it may handle high-res displacement a lot better. Thanks heaps, guys, for sticking around and waiting for this lesson to come out. The next lesson I'll be producing will be the user voted lesson, so I'm going to skip to lesson 11. I think it's better to compact the hair and skin lesson together with the finale lesson, so do those two one after each other, because there is going to be hair and skin featured inside the finale lesson also. Thanks heaps, guys, and I'll see you next time.